is so nice to be home. We had a great trip in California. I'll tell you about whatever you want to hear later. But we were glad to be there, spend time with family, and we're glad, very glad to be back here. This morning, we'll be continuing our series going through the Pentateuch, the 5 books of the law, or the 5 books of Moses. And today we are picking up in Numbers. We'll be looking at Numbers today. We're going to be even more cursory in the outline than we have for Genesis, Exodus, and Leviticus. And then we'll end up, the actual sermon, if you will, on Numbers will come out of 1 Corinthians chapter 10. But we'll get there when we get there. In Genesis, if you recall, the focus is relationships, but the theme, the key word that we had in Genesis, especially that carries us throughout the Old Testament and into the Gospel, is regeneration. We saw the creation of all things in Genesis. We saw the corruption or the degradation or degeneration of all things because of sin in the book of Genesis. And then in Genesis as well, we have the theme of regeneration, where God takes what we have broken and is fixing it to be even better than it was at first. We see regeneration in the book of Genesis. In Exodus, we saw the focus of deliverance and worship. We saw the people who were enslaved in Egypt brought out under God's mighty hand. We see his outstretched hand afflicting the Egyptians. We see his outstretched hand parting the Red Sea. We see his outstretched hand providing and nurturing his people all the way to Sinai, and there at Sinai. And then in Leviticus, we saw the identity of God placed on his people. The identity that I am holy. You will be holy because I, the Lord your God, am holy. And so we see him placing his character on the family that he has preserved, that he has given a promise to in Genesis to the descendants of Abraham. He has sustained them. He has not abandoned them in Egypt. He's delivered them from their oppression. He's brought them to himself at Sinai. He is placing his identity and his name on them. These are the people of Yahweh, the children of Yahweh. Now in Numbers, we're going to see God teaching his people. Teaching or discipline would be maybe my key word for the book of Numbers. Many would use the key word of perseverance. That's a great one for Numbers. We see the trials and the difficulties of striving to follow God. And we'll look at that a little bit as we go. But Numbers has very much to do with the discipline of the holy God. He's nurtured them there at Sinai. He's given them his expectations, his law, his identity. This is who we are. This is what we do. This is how we behave. All right, now let's go do that. And Numbers is about the now let's go do that as they're leaving Sinai towards Canaan. And so we'll look at how that goes in our outline today. A quick introductory note on the book of Numbers itself. Numbers is a great name for the first and 26th chapters of this book. And that's about it. Those are the 2 chapters with numbers in them. The book is called Numbers because it begins with the numbering of the people, a census there at Sinai. And so we have an apt name in that sense because that's how it starts. But that comes from the Greek. That's from the Septuagint by way of Latin that we call it Numbers. The Hebrews have called it the Wanderings, the book of the Wanderings. This is the book that takes us from Sinai to the border of Canaan, and they're preparing to go in. The farthest they get is just east of Jordan, and then they will, in Joshua's day, of course, actually go in to the Promised Land. And so when we look at this, that's the setting. We call it Numbers, but it's not primarily about numbers. It's primarily about the wanderings of God's people from the time they leave Mount Sinai. Because of that, we can basically break down the book of Numbers into 3 large sections, starting with the first 10 or 10 and a half chapters. 9.5 chapters, I guess you'd say, through chapter 10, verse 10, they are still at Sinai. Which means that from Exodus chapter 19 all the way until Numbers chapter 10, they are at Mount Sinai. That entire chronological period, that in fact you can pick up those pages in your text and you can say during these pages the people of God are at Sinai. They're not anywhere else. And so this all happens at Sinai. They're staging, they're counting the people. We'll get into the first breakdown. They're counting, they're deciding how God is telling them how they're going to move when they break camp, who's going to carry what, who's going to set up camp, so on and so forth. In chapter 10, beginning in verse 11, they start marching towards Moab. They get as far as the plains of Moab on the eastern or northeastern side of the Moab area, if I'm understanding. Again, the purpose of the lesson today is not geography. There's a couple of geographical notes I may throw in along the way. Numbers is a fascinating study in the geography of the movement of God's people, but a lot of it can't be verified. A lot of it is still speculation. And what is verifiable is hotly disputed. There's traditional routes for Numbers, as with Exodus, and then there's more likely than traditional routes proposed as well. I can point you towards good resources to look into that if you're interested. Again, the second main section, they are marching towards Moab. This period is the longest period in the book of Numbers. That chapter 10, verse 11 through 22, verse 1 covers 38 years. And it doesn't cover much of what happens in that span of time. It doesn't say in the first year all of these things happen, and then in the second year all these things happen. It's not long and drawn out. There's a handful of events that are recorded that took place during that time, but it is not a full and detailed chronology of the 38 years in the middle of the Israelites wandering. And then the final section is they're actually there. They're preparing for the promised land. There's some essentially final battles outside of the perimeter of where they're going to go in and occupy. And then some preparation. But we'll again get a more detailed look at this this outline here in a little bit. So when they're staging at Sinai, chapters 1 through 4 are the census and the muster. They're gathering together. They're first counting the people, how many people are in each tribe, how many people are in the different divisions of the Levites, who of the Levites is going to carry what implements of the tabernacle, what order are they going to march in, which tribes are going to go out first, which tribes are going to be the rear guard, and who's going to fall where in the middle of all of that. That's all prepared and declared in chapters 1 through 4 of the book of Numbers. A while ago, I did a brief study showing you how they camp around the tabernacle based on the description here in the beginning of Numbers. And essentially, the understanding that I have is that the bird's eye view of their camp around the tabernacle made approximately the shape of a cross. It was pretty even on the west, north, and east side, with the vast majority of the people camping to the south, or a larger number of people camping to the south. No one can say that they camped out like sticks away from the tabernacle. Not really the point, but that's something we talked about a while ago. That's chapters 1 through 4. When we get into chapters 5 and 6, we have some laws essentially about the purity of the camp. This is the first example of why I initially found Numbers really difficult to outline well. It seems disjointed in a way. If you read through it quickly, it seems like, okay, now he's going to tell us about this event that unfolds, or this command from God, and then he's going to tell us about some of the law that he probably just talked about either in Exodus or Leviticus by now. But okay, so this is here, and then he's going to go back. He's just a quick reminder of the law, and then he's going to go back to telling the order of events as they happen, right? But throughout, there's interspersings of these kinds of law or instructions regarding the law for the people. And initially, like I said, that makes it seem really disjointed. But then the more I've been thinking about it, it is disjointed in the sense that it's not a constant flow of narrative. there are seemingly random bits of law inserted that don't necessarily tie directly to what happens before it or after it. But thinking about the purpose of this book for us, and the book Wandering for a group identified by God as sojourners still today, I find some value or some relevance there. The day-to-day goings-on of our lives is and ought to be frequently broken up with sections of God's law and with sections of God's word and reminders of God's word. Our lives are not perfectly and smoothly joined together, flowing perfectly and easily from one thing to the next natural course of events. It's interrupted. We ought to do what we can, and maybe this is a stretch of a point to make, but I'll make it anyway. We ought to do what we can to make sure that we are interspersing our day-to-day activities with God's law, that we are frequently reminding ourselves and one another of God's law. It is for our lives, but there are parts of God's word that are not immediately relevant to what you're going through today. That's okay, read those parts anyway. So a small point, just something that kind of struck me. I'm sure you could unpack that even more and look at that, but in chapters 5 and 6, we see the first kind of break to insert some of the law from more about uncleanness to a test for adultery, which is interesting, and we're not even touching that at all today. And then chapter 6 has largely, almost exclusively, but for the last 5 or 6 verses, is mostly about the Nazirite vow, right? So it's about the purity of the camp and preparing their minds to be pure and to be law-focused and to be godly and to be holy, even though you're no longer in the midst of this mountain, this mountainous monument to my presence among you and the law that I've given you here. Now, we'll throw up the rest of this, and then we'll hopefully circle back to that point here in a second. But chapters 7 and 8 have to do with offerings at the tabernacle's consecration in chapter 7, then regarding the cleansing of the Levites in chapter 8. And chapter 8 ends with the retirement of Levites, but it's a more ceremonial, essentially, law that's given, and records of what they brought, what they offered for which tribes, and so on and so forth, which is the second most census-oriented thing that happens in the book named for the census, right? In chapter 9, we have the first time that they're celebrating the Passover outside of Egypt. They first celebrated it, obviously, in Exodus. This is the second celebration of the Passover, and this is all happening still at Sinai. We'll just go to the last bit. Chapter 10 through chapter 10, verse 10, the first 10 verses of chapter 10, have to do with the trumpets that they would use to signal for the camp when they were going out to war. It's a reminder, it's in here the way that it is, as a reminder that yes, you're going to go to war, and yes, you're going to have this practical thing to signal to the camp and everybody that you're going to war. But more than that, the trumpets that they blew when they were going to war was a reminder that God was with them. In Leviticus, there's a small blurb towards the end. It's in chapters 23 and following. One of those segments about feasts and celebrations is the Feast of Trumpets. I don't know that there's a direct or immediate tie. The language in Leviticus and in Numbers overlaps. They both talk about trumpets. But when you look at that passage in Leviticus, and then you look at this and the purpose of these trumpets in daily life, the reminder is once again God's presence among them. Yes, we're going to war, but your faith is not in the mighty men leading the charge. Your faith is not in your horses and chariots or the better swords that you have than the other people have, or the more fighters that you have than the other hand. Your confidence, your hope, your courage to go out to battle comes from the fact that God is in your midst, that God fights for you. And so that's the last thing that he tells them before they leave Mount Sinai. To the beginning of this, or actually I believe through chapter 10, if I'm not mistaken. Because I think the next timestamp is in verse 11. That's the next section starts with the timestamp. That in the second year, in the second month, on the 20th day of the month. But this chapter 1, verse 1 starts 3 months after leaving Egypt. You remember all that happened in the last half of Exodus? That happened in a 3-month period, including the giving of the law in Leviticus, right? Or the part of the law that was given in Leviticus. These people were not focused in that text on the people's relationship with God. There's a couple of instances that are recorded between Exodus 19 and the end of Leviticus. Just a couple. Another year passes, so a year and 3 months before they start heading out from Sinai. Or from the time they left Egypt to the time they leave Sinai, right? The rest of the book, we're going to see again and again their failures. We're going to see again and again a people who complain and grumble, who ask, just like they did in Exodus chapter 17 before they even make it to Sinai, is the Lord even among us or not? When we look at the wanderings of God's people, when we look at their failures here in this second phase in the book of Numbers, or the book of the wanderings, let's never forget that we're them. Let's never forget that we have the same tendencies. We'll come back to that towards the end of the lesson. When we see them marching to Moab, again, this covers a long period of time, the longest period of time covered in the book of Numbers. If you don't count the first chapter or first few verses of Exodus, I believe this section covers the longest span of time in Exodus through Deuteronomy. That's it. Here's how we can kind of further break it down. Again, there's a lot of events recorded in these chapters, and I'm not breaking down every single one. The purpose of this overview is to remind us that all of those events, all of these stories, all of these accounts that we know and love and teach to our children and talk about from time to time happen in this context. It's good to know that Nadab and Abihu fell because they profaned God's holiness. It's important, however, also to know that that happened while they were still at Sinai. And when he had just consecrated the priests, that's like the first thing that they do. That's the first recorded act of the priests after consecration is their failure. Knowing that account is good. Knowing the context of that account is important. And so when you look at the book of Numbers or the book of the Wanderings, there's a lot of accounts that we're familiar with. And it's important to know what happens and what God's people have done and how God responded to that. It's important also to remember the context in which that happens. Where is Israel at the time? What are they doing? What are they going through? What has just happened outside of that? And so in chapter 10, picking up at verse 11 and going through chapter 13, I realize that's confusingly put. It's not just those 3 verses, 11 through 13. It's chapter 10, verse 11 through chapter 13. That takes them all the way up to Canaan's border. During that time, there's the burning of the camp at Taberah. There's the quail added to their regiment of manna. There's the sedition is one term of it. The opposition of Moses by Aaron and Miriam, his brother and sister. And then the spies are sent out. So as soon as they start marching, they go out in stages from Sinai. The next 2.5 chapters, all of those things happen, including and ending with the sending of the spies and their report back to Moses. You remember, of course, what happens there. Of the 12 spies, 10 were intimidated by the locals and said, "We could never." 2 only, Joshua and Caleb, said, "God is with us, let's go. He's given us this land. It's there. Yeah, the fruit's pretty big. Check out, what we brought back, right?" So only 2 had faith in God. Those 12 spies spent 40 days spying out the land of Canaan, because after that, the people cried out and were rebellious and discouraged because of the report of the spies. That's the reason that it was a 40-year period of wandering in the wilderness. And so chapters 14 through 20 is their discipline in the desert. Chapters 14 through 20 is about account after account after account of these people who have been spared and brought out of Egypt by the mighty hand of God, who see the pillar of cloud and of fire around them day and night, and who still fail and grumble about how much better we had it back in Egypt. You remember the variety of spices and herbs and food that we had? We had so much good meat to eat in Egypt. I wish we had gone back there. Or surely God has brought us out here to die of thirst, to die of starvation, to die at the hands of our enemies, to die of this and that and the other thing. They grumble constantly. And God disciplines them. He chastises them to remind them, first of all, you're being ridiculous. And second of all, I have you. I'm with you. I'm close to you. You don't have to freak out. You don't have to lose heart. You don't have to be discouraged. You don't have to panic. I'm right here. The discipline in the book of the Wanderings, or in the book of Numbers, is to correct behavior. But it's doing that by reminding them that I, your God, am with you. Most of the discipline that we need from God is because we forget that He's with us. That He's here. Either we forget that He's watching and we do things thinking we're going to get away with it. I don't think that happens the most. Most of the failures of a Christian's life are when we lapse in faith. And we say, I know God says to do it this way, but I just don't see how that's going to pan out. We take matters into our own hands. We panic, we despair, we lose heart, and we need the same chastening, we need the same discipline that the Israelites needed. In that chapter, just to kind of remind you of the highlights, this is where they're given the curse that because of what happens after the spies come back, they're not allowed to enter Canaan. We have the rebellion of Korah. Remember the last section, 10 verse 11 through chapter 13, had the rebellion of Aaron and Miriam. Now in this next phase, as they're actually going through the desert, that we have the rebellion of Korah and Dathan. We have Moses striking the rock the second time. Quick note, both times, so at Sinai when he strikes the rock, or Mount Horeb when he strikes the rock, in Exodus chapter 17, and here in Numbers when he strikes the rock, again it brings water from the rock. Both places it's called the waters of Meribah. It's not saying that location moved. It is a reminder that the names of a lot of places is because of what happens there. In both texts, we're told that it's called Meribah because there they quarreled against the Lord. And the word Meribah is or sounds like the Hebrew word for to quarrel. And so it was also called Massah or Massah in Exodus 17 because they tested the Lord there. And so the name has less to do with being tied to a geographical point on a map and more to do with a reminder of what happened there. And in Exodus 17 at Mount Horeb or Mount Sinai, they tested the Lord and they quarreled. And here in Numbers, they again quarrel against God. And so because of that, and because of how, because of the quarrel, God, again, by chastening, provides for them, provides the water from the rock. But in doing so, we remember that Moses does more than he was supposed to and draws attention to himself, takes credit for God's work, and thereby makes holy power common. David gave a good lesson on that a while ago, so I won't re-preach it. Let's see, also in that is the plague of serpents. The bronze serpent incident is there in these chapters, and then that's most of the highlights of 14 through 20. last part of this, chapters 21 through the first verse of 22, which I don't like parsing that much, but that's kind of a conclusionary, is that a word, conclusionary? It's a conclusive, or concluding timestamp there in the beginning of chapter 22. Verse 1 says, "Then the people of Israel set out and camped in the plains of Moab beyond the Jordan at Jericho." So here they are, they're staged east of Jordan, and they're in the plains of Moab opposite Jericho. And that's essentially where they're going to stay until Joshua's day when they go in to the land of Canaan, starting with Jericho, right? During this time, we have several battles. They defeat Sihon, king of the Amorites, and Og, the king of Bashan, or Bashan. Those are the first things after the period of the 38 or so years of wandering in the wilderness. Right? Then we end with chapters 22, verse 2 through 36. Verse 13 is the last verse in the book of Numbers. First three chapters in this section, 22 through 25, are Balaam's efforts to bring a curse against God's people. We have the story, we remember the account of the prophet and his donkey and going to, on the pretense or being brought in to curse God's people, but the prophet only speaking what God allows him to speak. However, on the backside of that, seemingly, they learn that they can distract. If they can't curse them officially, and if they can't beat them in battle because God is with them, what they can do is they can lead them away. And so there's an intermarrying of God's people with the Moabites, or the worshippers of Baal. And in chapter 25 is kind of the last attempt. It's not attributed directly to the king trying to do this, but the context, I think, is designed to lead us to that conclusion. Not the main point. The people intermarry or are having relations with the worshippers of Baal, and there in chapter 25, after that, God draws attention to it, and Phinehas puts an end to the plague that was happening because of sexual immorality. In chapter 26, we have the second census, the other chapter that makes Numbers seem a worthy title for the book. Then in chapters 27 through 30, Moses is dealing with the fact that he's not going to lead the people into Canaan's land, and so he asks God to raise up a successor to come after him. Joshua is the one who is appointed. A good thing is said about Joshua in that section. God responds to Moses' request, and regarding Joshua, he says in chapter 27, verse 18, "The Lord said to Moses, 'Take Joshua the son of Nun, a man in whom is the Spirit, and lay your hand on him.'" And so he appoints Joshua, yes, but there's also this commendation that appointment is based on the fact that Joshua is someone who has the Spirit of God with him. Then in 31 through 33, we have more conquering happening. We have another battle as they defeat Midian, and they distribute the land east of Jordan, and they give instructions in chapters 34 through 36 about what's going to happen or how things are going to go in Canaan, from specific boundaries, starting in chapter 34, to cities of refuge and how that's going to happen, and cities for the Levites in chapter 35, to the concerns brought in chapter 36 about a man who has no sons but has daughters. Do they get the land after the father dies? And that's settled there, and that is where the book of Wanderings leaves off with the words in verse 13, "These are the commandments and the rules that the Lord commanded through Moses to the people of Israel in the plains of Moab by the Jordan at Jericho." This is where we leave off. Next time we'll cover Deuteronomy, Lord willing. I'll expect that one to be more of a two-parter, since there's a lot to cover there. Turn with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. The point of this study, the reason that we're going through the books of the law, is to find God's pattern, God's plan, and God's examples for families, for the roles that we have in our most intimate relationships with other human beings. Numbers serves that purpose just as well as the 3 books preceding it did, and as much as Deuteronomy following it will as well. But whenever we look at these books of the Bible about things that happened a really long time ago in a place very far from here to people we're not related to, at least that we know for sure of, it can be hard to really pay attention with the motivation of why I should change because of it. What in my life needs correction because of what happens in the book of Numbers? What in my life, what application is there? How do I become a more godly person based on what happens in the book of Numbers? There's a lot of answers to that question. There's a lot of really good and important answers to that question. But for time's sake, I'll just push on you Paul's answers to that question. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, he brings up what happens in the book of Numbers. Several of the things that happen in the book of Numbers. Let's start in verse 1, where he says, I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea. All right, technically so far he's just talking about Exodus. And all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. Now he's at least talking about Sinai, and certainly here very shortly he's going to be talking about events that take place or are recorded in the book of Numbers. Nevertheless, with most of them, God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. The biggest indicator that we're now talking about, the events in the book of Numbers. After the spies come back, everyone but 2 men were faithless. And with most of the Israelites, God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now these things took place as an example for us. As examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. That's the first takeaway. We'll come back to it. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. We must not indulge in sexual immorality, as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. We must not put Christ to the test, as some of them did and were destroyed by serpents, nor grumble, as some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages have come. Therefore, and this is the part of this text we probably know the best, therefore let anyone who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. It's probably worth an entirely separate sermon, and you might get it eventually from somebody here, of the specific things, breaking down the specific things that he tells them not to do. He tells us not to desire evil in verse 6. He says not to be idolaters in verse 7. He says not to indulge in sexual immorality in verse 8. He said not to put Christ to the test in verse 9, or grumble in verse 10. The summary, however, of all of those instructions is to examine yourself, humble yourself. And don't think for a second that you're immune to the foolishness of the Israelites. They had a pillar of fire and of cloud. They were camped around, day in and day out, camped around the tabernacle with the glory of God. They had months before any given grumbling incident been led through the Red Sea on dry land. They had just recently seen the defeat of Egypt without a single one of them raising up a sword. They walked with this. They saw the trembling Mount Sinai. And still, they grumbled and complained. And we like to think, because Jesus said, more blessed are you who, without seeing, still believe. Because the New Testament praises the faith of those of us who weren't around to see the direct hand of God and all the might and the power and the strangeness that they got to see. We think we have a superior faith, and in ways, we do. But do not think for a second that because we have the whole picture, that now we won't grumble, we won't fall into the traps that they fell into. How many times did you grumble just this last week? How many times did you complain about just God's own people? I'm not talking about the weather or traffic, which are ridiculous things to complain about, but not my point. How many times did you complain just about God's people? A brother or sister who did this or went there or said that? Hello, fellow Israelites. How many times did you commit idolatry this week? We're all so proud to say, I didn't bow down to a single idol this week. In fact, never in my life have I bowed down to an idol. I've never bowed down to a graven image and worshipped it. Not a calf that's supposed to represent Yahweh or anything else. None of them. I haven't done any of that, so I'm not guilty of idolatry. How many times should you have served your brethren and you found something else to prioritize instead? Something specifically outside of God's will. I'm not saying specifically sin, but specifically a carnal reason. Hello, fellow Israelites. How many times did you put Christ to the test? You think, well, I'm not like Satan. I didn't appear to him in the wilderness. I don't rail against him every day. And I don't cry out against him, convinced that he's abandoned me here. I don't put God to the test. I don't ask, is God really with us or not, the way that the Israelites did in Exodus 17 and then repeatedly in the book of Numbers. Haven't you acted as though God needs your help and your plan to see things through? Haven't you acted in a way that communicates, that expresses a deeper thought or understanding that your way is better than God's? You can explore all of those in greater detail. But how many of us, it's all of us, how often do we think that we're doing great? We've arrived at holiness. We have the right doctrine. Now it's just a matter of making sure the people around me do too. We have the right conduct in this, that, or the other thing. We have this part of our life figured out, and now it's just time to look at everybody else who doesn't have that part of their life figured out. I know this that somebody else doesn't know, and so I'm doing great. How often are you convinced that you stand? As often as it shortly after surprised you to fall. That's the context in which he tells us no temptation has overtaken us that is not common to man. That God is faithful and will not let you be tempted beyond your ability, but with the temptation he will also provide the way of escape that you may be able to endure it. He's not saying that he'll never bring you to a waterless land. He's not saying you'll never go up against an army that you can't take on. He's not saying here that you'll never come to a situation that you can't bail yourself out of because you have the Spirit. And you can do all things, right? Christ who strengthens you. He's saying every situation he's going to bring us to is designed to turn us towards him. To cry out to him first. Not to despair, because where is God? Why am I going to die like this? Why am I going through this? Why am I in this helpless situation where everyone's against me? Why am I in this helpless situation where I don't know the next thing to do, the next step to take? It's so that you'll look to God. When he brought them to Kadesh, the place where they spent 38 years in the middle of nowhere, he knew there wasn't water there. He knew that he was bringing 2.5 million people to a place without any major rivers, without any established springs or wells that we know of. He knew that. He didn't do it so that he can say, look, I'm going to make my people fail so that I can teach them a lesson. He said, I'm bringing my people to a difficult spot, and let's see if they do the right thing. And they didn't. They grumbled. Moses, of all people, took things into his own hands to a degree. He was proud, was arrogant, was, I believe the wording in Deuteronomy was, he broke faith. They failed. He brought them there to point their eyes to him. So they would say, hey, Lord, I know you've got a plan. We're getting kind of thirsty. How's this going? And instead they railed against him. What do we do? What do we do? How do you and I respond to perceived crises? How do you and I respond to the fact that you're not perfect? You have not arrived. You're not done growing. You're not done learning. You're not done humbling yourself to others. You're not done preferring God's way over your own. You're not done seeking the kingdom and his righteousness. Let's all humble ourselves under the mighty hand of a perfect and loving God. And if there's any way we can help you do that today or ever, start by coming forward to share with us as we stand and sing.